Well, Andy Agathangelou, you're very welcome to Counterpoint. We had a brief conversation over the weekend. I was amazed to read the content of the stuff on your website, and even more amazed after talking to you for reasons that I said to you at the time. It wasn't what I expected at all. So you set up the Transparency Task Force in 2015 or so. You've about 4,000 ambassadors throughout the world. You're basically starting a conversation around the requirement for much greater transparency in financial services, the trust deficit, the engagement deficit, conflicts of interest, scalping and all that kind of stuff. But what I'm very interested in talking to you about is fraud in the broader sense of the word, Andy, because you have been over here. You've got a sense of what's after happening in the mortgage market here, the securitization of mortgages, and the appearance in Irish courts throughout the country of service agents for people that only have a charge, pretending that they actually have legal ownership on property. How do you see that? What's your sense of it?
Eddie, my sense of it is that whenever you have a combination of high levels of power with inadequate levels of accountability, it's quite likely that you will have an abusive system. I see the current situation as an abusive system because the vulture funds, the banks, the credit services have high levels of power with inadequate accountability. And what's happening, of course, Eddie, is that the asymmetry of power between those who have the power and those who don't, in other words, the banks, the vulture funds, the credit services having the power, and the mortgagees who don't, means that there is a very high risk of miscarriages of justice, travesties of justice, and it's more than just a risk, it's a reality. Of course, we know, as a matter of fact, that there is extensive, widespread harm being caused as a direct consequence of what is effectively a failure to regulate, a failure to govern, a failure to police the system. Is not good enough. It must change. Irish people are suffering, British people are suffering. The similarities between the UK and Ireland are quite stark. So this is an international problem that needs to be dealt with.
And can you just pause you just a little bit there on we'll get into regulation in a while, but this imbalance of power between those at the top, high levels of power, low accountability, and the mortgagee holders. I mean, the people responsible for rebalancing that power are the regulators in the first instance, and the policymakers, are they not?
They are, but if we can speak very frankly, Eddie, there is what I call an unholy trinity. And what I mean by that is we have three issues that we have in the UK, we also have in Ireland. The first element of that unholy trinity is the revolving door problem. Of course, I'm talking about people who leave from a job at the regulator to a job in, let's say, the central bank, or from a banking organization to a regulator. This is resulting in an overly cozy relationship between the regulated and the regulator. That's the first element of the unholy trinity. The second element of that unholy trinity is the virtually inevitable conflicts of interest. And those conflicts of interest manifest in willful blindness. What I mean by that is regulators deliberately turning a blind eye to the evidence that's being given to them because they feel torn. They feel torn between, for example, maintaining the integrity of the banking system, which they would see as a high priority, and another part of their job that they don't always do very well at all, which is to protect consumers from harm. And that conflict of interest is a very important second part of this unholy trinity. And the third issue is very simply regulatory failure. So yes, you're absolutely right. It is the regulator's job to regulate. It's the regulator's job to make sure that the system works with integrity. But if they are not doing their job properly, the people who suffer are the people, but eventually the failure of the system results in very low levels of trust, very low levels of engagement, and eventually it all goes horribly, horribly wrong.
That's very interesting. The way you've brought in it as the Holy Trinity. That's certainly something that the Irish can understand. Given the way we started off with St. Patrick and the legend of the Shamrock, and so on. But what really came into my mind as you were saying that, which I think is a common problem in Britain as well as in Ireland, was the complete mis-selling and misuse and abuse that went on in the loan note marketplace, where people were being sold these loan notes by financial intermediaries at crazy levels of commission, 3 or 4 year loan notes, paying 10 to 15% commission, which was undisclosed. And a lot of these schemes turned out to have been completely, hyped way up beyond their capacity. And the losses in Ireland, I know, we're going to run, I think the losses, including consequential losses, are going to run between €500 million and €1 billion by the time the dust settles on a lot of these schemes.
Well, that's right. And what you're taking the conversation to there, I think, Eddie, is the inevitability of incentives being out of whack with the real world. There's a great quote. Warren Buffett's right-hand man, Charlie Munger, uses this quotation, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. So if you create a situation where there are very, very high levels of incentive, very high levels of reward, bonuses, commissions for a particular type of behavior, you will get that behavior. And again, it manifests in all kinds of areas. It's topical in relation to loan notes. Right now in the UK, we've got a huge issue to do with hidden commissions in the car finance scandal. And that story is a big story. It's getting bigger and bigger. But there's nothing new in this. Issues around overly aggressive incentives leading to various kinds of poor selling has been around for decades. We both know that. And the point is, because it has been around for decades and it's still not being dealt with properly, it once again enables us to accurately and correctly point the finger at poor regulatory enforcement.
Well, it's funny you should mention the car hire purchase and so on. I remember quite recently it was decided over here that that all of this credit around cars was going to come under the central bank regulatory system. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know who I feel sorriest for, the second-hand car salesman or the car salesman or the central bank, because it was going to be a real clash of cultures there. So it's not surprising to learn that there's been a substantial problem in the UK because of that. But when we go back into the Irish mortgage market, I think Theo was telling me there off camera, he thinks the number is something like up to 90,000 people got into trouble in maintaining their mortgage payments after the global financial crisis, and then fell into the whole trap of having their mortgage sold on to a vulture fund, who then organise a service agent to service it. And then the service agents are turning up in court making claims of ownership of the underlying property, when in point of fact all they have is a beneficial interest in a charge on the property, the paperwork for which may not be in order. And I just want to put this to you, that in one report it indicates that law firms redacted evidence and affidavits to the court in order effectively to mislead the court. And I think that's going back to, well, what was the incentive? How much were these law firms making from engaging in this activity? And of course the accountancy firms that also advised on how all this could be done and setting it up at the outset. All of those, if I'm correct, that this is a very, very substantial problem, are going to find that they're right in the middle of the unholy trinity.
Again, you're absolutely spot on, Eddie. It's no coincidence that both London and Dublin have issues around illicit money flows. And the direct consequence of the illicit money flows that are without doubt taking place results in an entire industry of so-called professionals who are generating very high levels of professional fees as a consequence of the role that they are playing in professionally, I put that phrase in inverted commas, Eddie, professionally enabling what is going on. We're not talking about something that is really too far away from cartel-like behavior, where the insolvency practitioners, the lawyers, the accountants, the auditors, the bankers, the property valuers, the entire ecosystem has an incentive to maintain the status quo and keep everything in the shadows, to the detriment of the mortgagee. And there's a great phrase, if you don't mind me mentioning another quotation here. It's the phrase from Justice Louis Brandeis, the US senator who wrote a book in 1914. The book was entitled Bankers, How They Use Other People's Money. And the phrase was, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And it's a great phrase because what it teaches us, Eddie, is that if we want to fix this stuff, and believe you me, we do, we have to get it all out into the open. And that's why the media, in all honesty, has got such an important part to play here. Both in the UK and in Ireland, we need more people like Eddie Hobbs helping to get the truth to the surface, because others who could help get the truth to the surface are not incentivized to do so. And if you don't mind me taking you into something we'll all be familiar with when we were children. When we were children, we learned about the fire triangle, the three things that you need, Eddie, to actually enable fire to start and to keep going. First of all, you need oxygen, you also need heat, and you need fuel. And the reason I'm talking to you, Eddie, about the fire triangle is that if you want reform to happen, you also need three things. First of all, you need a very strong evidence-based argument explaining that the status quo is no longer acceptable. You need a robust argument. The second thing you need is support amongst the politicians. Without that, things cannot change. The third thing that you need, and this is why you, Eddie, and people like you are so important, is you need proper media engagement. Because if we can't get the truth out there into the sunlight, if we can't disinfect what needs to be disinfected, then things will not change and the people will continue to suffer. This is what myself and many people like me are working very hard to try to do.
And how is that going for you over there? I mean, we have we very much a hollowed out media here, leaving aside what happened around COVID, which I have very strong views about. But I mean, just generally speaking in the financial and business area, because of the pressures that the legacy media has been under, the actual capacity of even established journalists to put the time and effort into the detailed legwork and grind into putting together printable reports is very tricky these days, especially with the way the legal system operates over here when it comes to defamation.
To be frank with you, there has been a general reluctance to report with any real enthusiasm the kind of things that we've been talking about. However, there is good news. As a direct result of several key people, I'll mention two, if I may, Eddie, if I may. Andy Verity, a BBC economics correspondent. Andy wrote a fantastic book called Rigged. It's all about the innocent whistleblowers and LIBOR traders who were sent to jail. They should not have been sent to jail. They were innocent. And his book, Rigged, has really moved the Overton window, made it far more acceptable for people to start to consider the idea that there are shenanigans going on between the banks, the Treasury, the government, etc. And secondly, if you don't mind me mentioning another name here, James Hurley at the Times. James is another great journalist, another great media professional, like Andy, like yourself, Eddie. He's done some great work. James has done some great work in relation to what we call the Ulster Bank scandal, which ties in very, very closely to the kind of things that have been going on both in the Republic of Ireland and in the North too, all about hidden credit margins and banking misconduct, the kind of fraud you started this conversation off with. And if I may say, there was a huge cleanup of the financial system in Australia a few years ago. It led to what they call a Royal Commission. And you know what? A lot of that came off the back of a journalist, a lady called Adele Ferguson. It was her persistent, tenacious reporting to expose the fraud and, frankly, corruption going on in the Australian banking system that forced the politicians to take action and open up a Royal Commission. So just to recap here, Eddie,
And can I just pause you there? What
Yeah.
specifically was happening in Australia that caused such scandal? What was this? What areas was she focusing on? Adele Ferguson.
Pretty much everything, really.
Okay.
The story really started with a very, very interesting case. A farmer, a shearer, sheep farmer in Australia. This gentleman borrowed money from the bank. The bank persuaded him to not only borrow the amount of money that he wanted to borrow, but also to borrow it in a foreign currency, in Swiss francs. They persuaded him it was a sensible thing to do. Interest rates moved, currency rates moved. Net result, he ended up owing something like 5, 6, 7 times more than he should have ended up borrowing. Now, the good news is that gentleman, who was very badly damaged by this, later became an Australian politician. And the combination of his work, Adele Ferguson's work, the journalist's work, and also other whistleblowers who came forward from various banks, helped to open up a massive can of worms. And here's a prediction for you. Ready? I reckon there's a can of worms in London, and I reckon there's a can of worms in Dublin too.
Yeah.
And it's just a matter of time before it all gets opened right up.
And just focusing on Dublin, you've been over here, and I know you've looked at what's going on in some detail. So where do you see, like, when you talk about a can of worms in Dublin, what specifically, what particular worms are getting your attention?
Well, the things that we're spending a lot of time on, of course, are the vulture funds. The vulture funds. There is egregious, inappropriate understanding of use of the laws, the rules, the regulations around proof of title. It's being weaponized deliberately. It's contributing to banks making a great deal of money that they should not be making. It's also, of course, contributing to homes being repossessed. So vulture funds are the thing that have to be exorcised out of the banking and finance and mortgage system in Ireland. Until that happens, Eddie, your entire property market is going to be contaminated with a diseased culture of exploitation of weak, innocent, vulnerable people who don't have access to legal support, who don't have legal aid, who are outmaneuvered by big lawyers and banks, who are acting as litigants in person. It's like feeding, it's like, they're being run over. They're being bulldozed in the courts. This has to stop.
And so really your formula then for doing that, based on your experience, is obviously this combination of, getting the evidence, getting key politicians informed and behind it as key centres of influence in the political area. And then, of course, you need proper media champions to continue the focus on it. And to drag it out into the sunlight, to use your expression. I mean, that's a Bram Stoker solution at the graveyard scene at the end of the Hammer horror movie. But when you say it compares to London, is it the same problem there, or is it a different type of problem that you think that's going to come out into the open in London?
Broadly speaking, they're similar. If I can be very, very frank, Eddie, you've got a bigger problem in Dublin than we have in London.
Okay.
If I can speak very frankly.
Do, please do. That's the whole point of having you on.
The media in Ireland is pretty much closed down on this. The relationship between the media outlets, the establishment, the political system, the banking system is so cozy. I take you back to the unholy trinity. The revolving door problem, conflicts of interest, regulatory capture. I go back to what I said at the beginning. If you have a combination of high levels of power with low levels of accountability, it all starts going rogue. And if I can go off on a brief tangent, you'll be very familiar, I'm sure, Eddie, with the wonderful ITV documentary about the post office scandal. The post office scandal is all about that same thing. High levels of power, low levels of accountability. It doesn't really matter what the industry is. The first thing we have to do is accept that human nature means that if you have high levels of power, low levels of accountability, you have opacity rather than transparency. If you don't have transparency, truthfulness, and trustworthiness, it all goes horribly wrong. It goes wrong, and ordinary people suffer. That's what we've got. Your media in Ireland has got a long way to go.
Yeah. No, I would accept that completely. I think there's one or two stars there, however, in there. There's some diamonds in amongst the coal. But the difficulty here is at the editorial level, the coziness, and unfortunately there is no state largesse going into the Irish media itself. You know, the main state broadcaster has just been bailed out by the taxpayers to the tune of $750 million, which you can multiply that by 20-fold to get it to kind of UK levels. And unfortunately, the print media themselves are receiving government money. So I think that's a very, very unhealthy situation for the fourth estate, whose job really is to hold the government and policymakers to account and to keep on their case, ad infinitum, so that they become more afraid of the people than the people are of the government, which is the way it's supposed to be. That hasn't been the situation over here. There's a long way to go, but there's some good young talent, Andy, coming through. Theo would be one of them in time to take over those editorial roles. Unfortunately, we've also had a problem here where the schools of journalism themselves are very much driven by kind of left progressives in their attitude, you know, which is like looking at all of this as an ideological issue rather than actually looking at it as a mechanical problem that can actually be solved, and a moral problem as well. But it all can be solved. But it takes. But I think these are cycles, really, aren't they? I mean, we get these scandals, breath of fresh air, new people come in, and before we know it, 10 or 20 years later, we're back into the same kind of scandal area again. There seems to be a cycle. I don't know what it is. Maybe, perhaps you've your ideas on how you maintain a high level of ethics and moral behaviour in when so much money can be made by such a small number of people so quickly.
That's right. I do believe this does go in cycles, and what you eventually end up having is a combination of real, authentic leadership and complete dissatisfaction amongst the masses, amongst the people. This does go in cycles. There's a lovely quotation, Eddie. I'm gonna read it out. It's so powerful, and this goes back to the early 1960s, and it talks about the importance of speaking out and and refusing to accept the status quo. It's a quotation by Robert F. Kennedy. I'm going to read it out, Eddie. I think this is so powerful. Frankly, this quotation sums up my life's work right now in terms of working with people to help speak out. The quotation is this: every time we turn our heads the other way, when we see the law flouted, when we tolerate what we know to be wrong, when we close our eyes and ears to the corrupt because we are too busy or too frightened, when we fail to speak up and speak out, we strike a blow against freedom and decency and justice. And Eddie, I know there are literally tens of thousands of people in the UK and tens of thousands of people in Ireland, north and south of the border, who can directly relate to the idea that they are living with the consequences of a dishonest system that is exploiting an asymmetry of power for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many. And given that we live in parliamentary democracies, both you and I, it really is disappointing that it is the way that it is. What needs to happen is real political leadership needs to come to the surface. We need that in the UK. I'd like to suggest you need that in Ireland too.
Well, I think we certainly do. I only hope that it doesn't happen like this, but I suspect it will. That there's going to be a major fracture here. Events will just, will come to the surface. It's going to expose a huge amount of movement of mortgages across various players that should have never happened, and it's going to be one hell of a mess to try to resolve. And there's going to be a lot of reputations shredded when all that happens. Major accountancy firms, major legal firms, whoever, the funds themselves coming in. And also I think it's going to extend into the state as well, into the regulatory system. All of that will eventually come under the spotlight because that's what has to happen if it's going to get cleaned up.
I completely agree. The system does need to be exorcised. In the future, people will be wondering, why did the government in the UK and in Ireland allow regulated mortgage products to be sold to unregulated vulture funds, where they were in effect given complete permission to do whatever they wanted? Fundamental questions like that, Eddie, are going to be asked, and people are going to want to know answers. This isn't just an abstract academic issue. People's lives are being ruined. People are being made homeless. Some people have been taken to the brink of suicide and have gone beyond it. As you know, as I know, this has got to be one of society's biggest problems on both sides of the sea between our two countries, and it needs to change.
Well, I'm glad we're finishing on that point, Andy, because one of the things that struck me when I was reading Theo MacDonald's housing report from September 2024 a second time was that there was like a series of blunders. It was like the perfect firestorm of blunders being made by government and regulators and so on, that just simply opened the door for all this activity to happen and then did nothing about it. And then, you know, it's just like as I got older and looking at all of these things, I've been in and out of the wars for 30 years on the consumer side, for, you know, since the early 90s. And it seems to me, and I hope I'm wrong, that there's an intelligence behind this. It's an intelligent design. It's not a series of unconnected blunders of policy making. There's more involved than that, and I suspect that it has to do with money. I hope I'm wrong, but it does. You just get that whiff of saying they couldn't possibly have made so many consecutive blunders of decisions that have now magnified to the problem that we've got, and unfortunately they did. So you either choose to believe the accidental story, or you lean more into what I think happened, and that was a lot of money changed hands.
If we can think of that point in the context of football, you know, how many questionable decisions have got to be made by a referee before people start becoming suspicious as to whether the referee has got the integrity of the game in his mind, or some other motive. The mathematics are telling us that every time the dice is rolled, if it keeps coming up in the favour of the vulture funds and the banks at the expense of the ordinary mortgagee, the ordinary person, then why? You know, the mathematics are not in favour of the person who needs the bank, who needs the support. That's what needs to change. There is something wrong. It's obvious.
Well, let's keep an eye on it together. I'll keep an eye on what's happening, you know, from afar as well in the UK through the financial press and so on. So that'll be very interesting. So Andy Agathangelou, I got it right a second time, I think. I just want to say thank you so much. That was absolutely a great contribution. I want to thank you for that, for your clarity of thought and the way you're communicating what would otherwise be very complex concepts across to people in a manner that they can understand, which of course is part of the requirement of the Transparency Task Force, which you've been involved in now since 2015. So I wish you well with that. I hope we'll stay closely in touch, and we'll have you back again on Counterpoint at some stage in the future to give us an update.
And just before I go, Eddie, may I please return the compliment? Please never underestimate the importance of the work that you do, Eddie, in bringing the truth to the surface and having the challenging conversations that other media professionals back away from. Eddie, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you and good night.